collect old irons. This is the second of a series of videos that we are doing about old irons, which are of wide interest by collectors and historians around the world. The title of this particular episode is The Humble Flat Iron. Humble because we're talking here about the category of irons that's most ubiquitous, most common, and particularly low price. What we call the flat iron was in past years, 100 years ago or more, called the sad iron. Sad was a term going back at least to the 1300s in England, and it meant solid, heavy. These are solid and heavy. The term was applied to irons used in for pressing fabric pretty much universally in England about the 1600s, although we generally use these terms applied to flat irons and their immediate derivatives nowadays. Before we go any further, we might start with the difference between wrought and cast irons. Let me pull out a wrought iron here. A wrought iron is made by a blacksmith. Blacksmith would take a bar of iron, heat it red hot, pound it with a hammer, and you can see the pounding on the base, pound out a handle of some design, affix the two together by a rivet or some other way to produce a single piece iron. Most wrought irons have a rod that makes the handle and it's twisted to produce a somewhat ornamental pattern, maybe a good grip. This one's a bit unusual. This one has a rod flattened and then curled around here, hollow on the inside, and within there is a piece of metal. These are, in the collector's community today, called slave irons. And the idea here is that this would be used by a slave or a maid in the next room perhaps, and that you would have the slave using this so you could hear them working, so you know that they were doing what you wanted them to do. I'm a bit critical on that. I don't think you'd have any trouble hearing them in the next room because they're ironing, and ironing's a pretty violent process. You're pressing on these fabrics and you're making some noise. You don't need a bell in the handle. And for that matter, if you put the hands around the handle, you can't hear the bell anyway. So here's my idea. I think I've seen a bunch of these and they all tend to be fairly small, fairly thin in terms of the base. And my guess is that these are toys. Made a small size with a ring on the inside because, you know, that would appeal to that children audience. So from here, most irons that American collectors collect are cast irons, and let's take a look at some cast irons over here. But first, let's look at the stove here. This is a laundry stove. This is a stove that would have been in a laundry room, and many houses back 100 years ago, mid or larger size, might have a laundry stove. You know it's a laundry stove because it's got flat faces around the middle of it, and that is where you would rest flat irons. So let's take a look at this flat iron. This flat iron is a particularly common, simple flat iron. It is cast in the sense that it was made by a mold with hot liquid iron poured into the mold to produce the base, separate mold to produce the handle, again these put together, and this was done in a factory, in a foundry, and there were many foundries back in the olden days. This particular one has a simple handle, no embellishments, and on the top of the base there's a 6, and that might have been the weight or it might have been an inventory number. I had this one weighed at the post office. It's 5 pounds 13 ounces, so it could go either way. Let me pick another simple iron here. This is an iron that I got just this past week at the Central Maine Antique Mall. I went and bought some stuff. I was working my way out the door and I saw this thing sitting on a shelf. It is, again, a very simple iron. It has a cast base. It has a simple handle. It could have been blacksmith made, but I think it was made at the same factory as everything else here. What's interesting about this iron is not so much the iron itself, but the use it was put to after it served its job as a pressing iron. After that long history, the family moved to any of the variety of more sophisticated irons, and then this was painted. We call this toll painting. It's a kind of folk art. And a lot of irons, old irons, ultimately were painted, and there are people who collect these decorative painted irons. The markings here are very bright, but I believe that they're still old and not a recent toll painting. It has a heart design. It has the kind of rather intricate painted roses on the handle that were typical of toll painting. This iron I bought for $8. That's with the toll painting. Without the toll painting, it might even be worth less than that. These flat irons generally have, simple flat irons generally have a value of, $6 to $12, $15. That's about the lot. They are very simple, very common. The collectors, if they're looking for irons, including flat irons, they're looking for something a little above that simple end of things, such as this one. This one has a beaded edge along the bottom of the iron. It has a fairly nice handle, shaped for the hand with some cross hatching on it, and it has a patent date here. I got to turn this around. It says patented 1862. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the patent was for. The patent might literally have been for this handle. On the top of the base, it says P.W. Lamb's patent, Albany, New York. So it has a company name, it has a location, it has a patent date. Much more interesting. Still not that expensive. Something like this might be worth $15, $20. Maybe somebody who's collecting irons from Albany, New York might put a higher value on that. And there are collectors that do collect irons from a very particular location or from a very particular foundry. My wife and I once visited a collector in England, Birmingham, and he collected only flat irons that were made in the Birmingham area, and he could recognize them by the various markings and the font of the numbers and so forth. He had 1,200 different irons in his collection. There are a great many of these out there. The process of making these irons, the iron is all hot, handle and base, and so to make these irons, to use these irons, you'd have gloves on or rags to keep your hands from being burned. It was not an easy process. And so, particularly starting the middle part of the 1800s, people were looking for ways to perhaps make this easier. And there were many kinds of ideas that vendors had and manufacturers had to make the handle colder than the base. And this is one take on that. It looks like, from where you are, just a regular ordinary flat iron, and in some sense it really is. But the middle piece here, there's an iron base and an iron handle, but the middle piece is soapstone. And so that would have been an insulator, presumably, to keep the hot here and keep the handle cooler. And there were many different kinds of ideas for doing this. This is a very heavy iron. It has an 8 there that I think communicates the larger size. This iron is made by the A.H. Hubbell and Company, Elmira, New York. But the base here actually has two parts. There is a lower part and then there's an upper part, and between them is an insulator, and that would hopefully delay the heat from getting up into the handle part of the iron. Again, many different ways that this was done. This is a bit more intricate one. This has got a patent date, and I got to remind myself, 1868, stamped into the shield. Very traditional base, but it's got this corrugated posts on both sides, and I'm not sure exactly if there was any reason for this. It might have just been this particular designer and his idea of the way an iron should look, or maybe there was the idea that the metal would take longer to get from the base to the handle. But for good measure, the handle itself is made out of wood. You don't see this too often in the flat irons. And then also the shield here. The shield, again, is giving the hand some protection so that it doesn't burn itself in touching the hot posts and base of the iron. No idea the company that made this. So we've seen a little bit of a wrought and some of the cast irons. The flat irons come in all kinds of shapes and purposes. There's various specialty flat irons, and let me show you a few of these. These represent categories in their own right that we'll talk about in greater detail in later videos, but we might as well get an introduction to some of these. This is the Sherman patented iron, and it has a long and narrow shape. This is a sleeve iron, so it's designed to go into the sleeves, shirts, pants. Here is another sort of traditional flat iron shape, although it's got a very nice handle here with a patent applied for. Again, that might be just for the handle design itself. Fits the hand very comfortably. And it says here, steel polisher. This is a polishing iron. The bottom is flat on the very bottom, but the sides are rounded all the way around. And that would allow you to put more weight over a smaller area to give that polished sheen surface that you wanted for certain fabrics. So the steel polisher. I have another of these specialty flat irons here. This one has a 20 on it. I didn't weigh it, but it certainly feels like 20 pounds. It has a C in the shield. That's Colebrookdale, Pennsylvania. Very major iron producer with a long history. Has the cross-hatched handle. Is very typical of that manufacturer. This is very heavy. This would be for heavy-duty work, either for very heavy fabrics or maybe used by a tailor. So, tailor's iron. Besides the various utilitarian special shapes that these irons could take on, there are all kinds of exotic shapes as well. And let me show you, and again, I am just picking some representative examples out here. There are many more. But let's look at this iron. Is in the shape of a swan or a goose, a duck maybe. By the way, this is part of a lot of irons in the shape of waterfowl. The Americans apparently love these. They come in various shapes and sizes. Many of them, if you find them with their original paint, they have various colors, and some of these can be very pricey. This particular large iron, and I should tell you, this iron is a reproduction. I can tell it's a reproduction because it doesn't have that absolute flat face down here that an iron would have if it was designed to be used as an iron. A full-sized original iron of this shape and size might be worth a couple, $300. So they can be pricey. Again, of these duck goose irons, many different factories making these things at different sizes and somewhat different shapes. Let me pull this one out. This was just sent to me a few weeks ago by my good friend Richard Gillis in Georgia. I mention his name out loud because he's a friend of mine, but he's also a very good friend of the entire iron collecting community. Richard is a fix-it person in terms of irons. He likes to take distressed irons and bring them back to their previous glory. This one was originally rusted, and now he has buffed this down to something like it must originally have been. This is a European iron, Scandinavian, maybe Denmark. It is cast, base and handle cast as a single piece. Being cast, that means probably dating to the late 1800s. Again, horse for the handle. It's got a rose design on the top of the base. I showed this iron to a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, and she has horses, and she said that the way that the lips of the horse are pursed, that this would be a female horse in heat. And that might explain something to me. The Europeans, in particular, often gave irons as wedding gifts. There's sometimes his and her and special initials and dates, and these are very highly collectible. And I wonder if these irons were also given as something of a fertility symbol. I always see that forward part in terms of the horse's lips. Richard gave me this iron as well. This is not a horse looking at his tail, it's a dog maybe, but it seems to have the same kind of look about it. And so there you have it, the humble flat iron. But I think you'll agree with me that the humble flat iron is not so humble. These things have a very long history, hundreds of years of being the workhorse of the household, no pun intended, and they come in a very great many styles, shapes, sizes, and so forth. And what we'll do in the next videos is we'll be talking about what became technologically to these irons over the course of time. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.